Former Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Odinga has died at the age of 80. He was reportedly undergoing treatment in India when he suffered a cardiac event during his morning walk in Kerala. He was a long-time opposition leader and a key figure in Kenyan politics, serving as the country's Prime Minister from 2008 to 2013. Let's unpack the story further. We're joined by Christine Mungai. She's the news editor at The Continent. Christine, it's great to talk to you. And what a legacy he leaves behind, the former Kenyan Prime Minister. 5 failed attempts at the presidency.
Thanks, Michelle. It's a complicated legacy for sure. As you rightly say, he has been a very prominent opposition leader, has fought for democracy, for the rule of law, for human rights, but also has been a political opportunist over the years, if we're being honest. And for several successive administrations, even though he has never clinched the presidency, he was always very consequential to the political settlement in Kenya, which made him an important figure even when he loses elections. And in some ways, that made him, make some political calculations that end up benefiting himself and the political elite, but at the same time inspired some incredible loyalty and was an inspirational figure in some ways. But in recent years, I would say that political kind of deal making is what his most recent legacy will be all about. And in some ways, I think slowed down Kenya's democratic transition in some ways, because that deal making created a stability in the political elite that was actually detrimental to the majority of citizens.
Tell us more about that, Christine, the impact that this deal making had on Kenya's journey to democracy.
Yeah, so Raila Odinga has been, the key political figure in Kenyan politics for 35 years now. He was detained in the 80s by President Moi's regime for almost a decade for agitating for multi-party democracy, and was very instrumental in reinstituting multi-party democracy in Kenya in the 90s. But I would say that from the mid-2000s onwards, as his political clout reached its zenith, its highest peak, the kind of dysfunctional nature of Kenyan politics is that there was a lot of because we're a deeply divided country when it comes to ethnicity, and also in some ways ethnicity follows political lines. Raila Odinga is one of the only politicians who was able to consistently garner national support from different parts of the country. And those political formations looked different at different times, but in all those seasons, he was a very important player. But what does that mean? It means that even as an opposition politician who is at the forefront for agitating for a better life for Kenyans and for constitutionalism and for democracy and human rights, at the end of the day, this horse trading that he became very famous for, in the long run, and what I would say is, what he will be remembered for now is, kind of being a break on that full democratic transition. So as a country, we have ended up just being caught in a game of musical chairs. And I would say that Raila Odinga has been the key player in that game.
I mean, he has taken election results on review, Christine. And you'll tell us whether there is a sense that he had a basis for arguing the outcomes of the elections, particularly perhaps against Ruto.
I think he did have a basis, and not only in this most recent election, but as you say, he has contested the presidency 5 times. And for several of those elections have been disputed. And he has been, the key opposition figure at the center of that dispute. Michelle, in Kenya, a lot of times we feel like we go 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, or vice versa. And, Raila has been one of those figures that has been, moving the country forward and back at the same time. So, for example, in 2013, he was the opposition candidate against the incumbent Uhuru Kenyatta, and whose deputy was William Ruto at the time. And the Supreme Court ruled that that election was not free or fair, and they annulled the election, and there had to be, another election called. So I think that was such a pivotal moment in Kenyan history that a Supreme Court can actually overturn an election result. At that point, it was also rare in Africa for that to actually happen. But at the same time, this is the same person who last year, after in the middle of the political protests by the young people in Kenya, what we refer to here as the Gen Z protests, the young people were very categorical that they did not want Raila to be part of this protest, that they had it, they were going to do their thing. And what ended up happening is that Raila came back into the picture and had a deal with Ruto, had a handshake. And basically that kind of sucked the oxygen out of the movement and kind of put a brake on what was being agitated for last year. William Ruto dismissed his cabinet, but when he reappointed his cabinet, several seats went to Raila's allies. So this is what I'm saying. There's a level of deal making that ends up in the long run making these movements stillborn and keeps us in a loop for a much longer time than would have otherwise been.
Yeah.
But at the same Raila Odinga's legacy is uncontested in some ways, especially in those early decades, in those early years when the repression was so much more overt, so much more active. Like I said, he was jailed for a decade, which is no small thing, But at the end of the day, people say a man's legacy is only as good as his last act. And for me, as a Kenyan, I can't ignore what the last 10 years have been like, 10, 15 years, I would say.
Yeah. A political mobilizer is what he's being described as well. This is on the BBC's reporting on his death, Christine. The 2007 disputed election, we've got 5 disputed elections to choose from, but 2007 is perhaps a seminal one, just given how violence erupted in Kenya. I mean, it was called the biggest crisis in Kenyan history.
Maybe post-independence or multi-party history. Kenya is a country that is not short of crises. So I don't know if I would certainly say that from a national level, in terms of an election and a national presidential dispute, that definitely was the biggest flashpoint, the most serious kind of crisis that we have lived through. I think I would say that to this day, there's a level of closure that Kenyans have never had around that election, and how instrumental it was in setting us off on a path where, in 2002, through the ballot, we removed a dictator. President Moi had been in power for 24 years at that point, and Raila was the key figure that mobilized all the disgruntled voices at the time, and was able to, mobilize them together to create a united opposition, which is something we had never experienced before in Kenya, and possibly never have since. But that political formation in 2002 would not have happened without Raila. He was the one that made it happen. But then in 2007, we are here in a disputed election that ended up displacing hundreds of thousands in Kenya. More than 1,000 people were killed. But I think the long shadow of the 2007 election is, we are still living under that shadow of ethnic mobilization is still very much in play in this country. But I think more than that is the kind of political cynicism, I would say, this idea of, political office being an end in itself. In Kenya, we have different parties coming up in every single election cycle. And to his credit, the Orange Democratic Movement that Raila has led for the past 20 years is, one of the few political parties that has, stood the test of time, has been an active party for 20 years. But he has traded in, ODM's political clout, following, with all these special purpose vehicles that the different presidents and, political elites have come up with. So in some ways, he is described as a kingmaker in that way, because he always has something to, he always has a card up his sleeve. He always had an ethnic bloc or a political stronghold to trade. But I think in some ways, Kenya reached the absurd end of that, where Raila was actually in the same camp with Ruto right now at the point of his death, which means that in some ways, his dealsmanship and all this kind of wheeler-dealering that he was very good at, that, sometimes, Raila sometimes is described as an enigma, political genius, someone who could not predict his next move. But I would say that in hindsight, in the long read of Kenyan history, his instinct of this deal making makes Kenya a very dysfunctional place politically, even if on the surface it looks quite democratically resilient.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to see the reaction in Kenya, Christine. William Ruto, the Kenyan president, was meant to give an address to the public, to people in the country at about 7 o'clock GMT, 7:30 GMT, pardon me, so 9:30 South African time. I don't believe that address has started yet, but we did have some cameras there on the scene of where he was meant to give that address, and it was interesting to see the different reactions, some quite somber, some people quite emotional as well.
I began by saying that his legacy is complicated, and so Kenyans are going to feel the full range of emotions, because what Raila Odinga has been to this country is not just one thing. He has genuinely done very contradictory things in his life, but at the same time, he would evoke the whole range of emotions, from grief to disbelief. Some people are seeing this as a new dawn in Kenya in some ways, because he had such a gigantic influence on the country. For me personally, I feel that we are about to witness a huge political realignment in this country, because some people, some prominent Kenyan leaders, all the way to the highest levels, are in those positions because of Raila's influence. And with Raila out of the picture, then this field is wide open, and we are about to see some big changes happening. That's what I expect in the next few months. We are heading into an election in 2 years' time, in 2027, which means that this is the first time in 25, 30 years that we are having a multi-party scene without Raila Odinga, and it's going to be a whole new ball game, because we've never been in this place before as a country.
And hopefully a whole new ball game to the benefit of people in that country. Christine Mungai, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining us.